Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're really plunging into the history of Norway.
A fascinating subject.
Definitely. And our mission here isn't to give you a dry lecture. We want to pull out the most important, the most compelling insights from Norway's journey.
Right, from those really ancient times right up to, well, where it stands today.
We've looked through quite a bit of material, historical overviews, academic stuff, and we're aiming to highlight those key turning points, maybe some surprising facts too.
And what really stands out, I think, is how Norway's geography, those fjords, the mountains, it's not just scenery, it's fundamentally shaped its history, its culture, everything.
Absolutely. So, okay, let's start at the very beginning. Prehistoric Norway. We're talking roughly 9,500 BCE to about 1800 BCE.
Yeah, and you have to picture this landmass just emerging from the last ice age.
So the glaciers retreating, that was the key event.
A massive one. Around 10,000 BCE, as the ice pulled back, it literally sculpted the landscape we see today, the valleys, the coastlines, making it habitable.
Opening up the land.
Exactly. A blank canvas, in a way, for the first people.
And they arrived around 9,500 BCE, nomadic hunters.
That's the timeline, yeah. Mesolithic cultures like the Fosna-Hensbaka culture you find in western Norway, and they were incredibly adept with stone tools.
Right, they had to be, didn't they, for survival?
Absolutely. Their whole existence was tied to the rhythms of the land and sea. Fishing, hunting, gathering it required real ingenuity and a deep connection to the environment. It wasn't primitive, it was highly adapted.
Then comes a pretty big shift around 4000 BCE. Agriculture arrives.
Likely influenced by southern Scandinavia. Farming, domesticated animals, it changes everything.
How so? More stability.
Yeah, relative stability, definitely. And we start seeing signs of more organized social structures, even early religious beliefs showing up in burial sites, those megalithic structures. It hints at a move towards settled communities.
And a different way of seeing the world, maybe.
Perhaps, yeah, a shift from a purely nomadic existence.
Then, around 1800 BCE, we hit the Bronze Age. This seems to be when Norway gets more connected to the rest of Europe.
Precisely. Trade starts picking up. Things like amber become really valuable commodities.
This is not just goods moving, but ideas too.
Exactly. Technology, cultural practices. It integrates Norway into that broader web of European prehistory, sets the stage for what comes next.
Okay, so let's leap forward to, well, arguably the most famous period, the Viking Age. Late 8th to mid-11th century.
Right. And Norway, along with Denmark and Sweden, really bursts onto the world stage here. Incredible seafaring skills.
But it wasn't just raiding, was it? That's the popular image.
No, not at all. That's a simplification. It was a period of intense exploration, really extensive trade networks, and a huge cultural influence that spread far and wide.
And Norwegians were central to this.
Absolutely, especially with those long ship designs.
Ah, yes, the long ships. They were revolutionary, weren't they?
Totally. They weren't just coastal vessels. They could handle the open ocean, crossing the North Sea, sailing down European coasts around Britain, Ireland, and even
across the Atlantic to North America, way before Columbus.
Centuries before, yeah. And specifically, Norwegian Vikings made these significant expeditions eastwards, too, towards Jarmaland. That's roughly the Kola Peninsula area in modern Russia.
Driven by trade.
Primarily, furs, fish, valuable ivory. And it wasn't just rogue adventurers. We see evidence that Norwegian royalty understood the strategic value of these northern routes and were involved. It suggests a level of coordination.
Okay, this is really interesting. This wealth coming in from the voyages, it didn't just stay in individuals' pockets, did it? It actually reshaped Norway itself.
Fundamentally, that influx of wealth fueled the rise of powerful local chieftains. Being able to gather and then redistribute those spoils, silver, goods became a key way to build loyalty and consolidate power.
So it paved the way for a more centralized system, like a monarchy.
Exactly. A shift away from purely tribal structures towards something more like a nascent kingdom.
And the origins of these Vikings in Norway, it's tied to the landscape again, isn't it? The name itself.
You've hit it. Norway. The North Way. It points directly to the importance of the sea. That coastline, full of fjords, provided natural harbors, fostered this deep-seated seafaring culture.
So by the 9th century, they're already pushing north.
Yeah, chieftains from places like Hålogaland are exploring up into Finnmark and the Kola Peninsula, mainly for that lucrative fur trade.
And this wasn't just casual trade. There was an economic system around it.
Definitely. Fur was like currency in many ways, especially when coinage was limited. The taxation system often relied on collecting goods, furs, hides, so those northern areas were economically vital.
And kings like Hakon V were actively trying to control this.
Yes, building fortifications, setting up laws about administration and tax rights, even negotiating with neighbors like the Prince of Novgorod about these territories.
What about the people already living there, like the Brarmir? How did the Norwegians interact with them?
It was complex, a mix of cooperation and competition. As more Norwegian settlers, peasants, fishermen moved into areas like Finnmark by the mid-13th century, interactions became more common.
So not just conquest.
Not solely. There were royal policies aimed at coexistence, like King Haakon actually allocating land for the Jarmir. So strategic alliances, integration attempts were also part of the picture.
Okay, so recapping the Viking expeditions, it's trade, it's plunder, yes, but also settlement.
Absolutely. And the Norwegian focus was often westward, the British Isles, Ireland, Iceland, Greenland, and that early foray into North America.
The longships were key to all this. Versatile things.
Incredibly versatile. Shallow draft meant they could navigate open seas and shallow rivers, reaching deep into continents.
And they left a lasting mark, didn't they? Culturally, genetically.
Especially in places like the British Isles, yes. They were connectors, moving goods, furs, amber, tragically, slaves too, reshaping economies and cultures wherever they went.
Let's zoom in on Norway itself in the 10th century. What was Viking society like back home?
It was very hierarchical. You had this powerful warrior, elite kings, jarls at the top. Their large halls were the social and political hubs.
And poetry was important. Skaldic poetry.
Very important. It was a sophisticated art form, often commissioned by rulers to celebrate victories, preserve history, reinforce their status. Part entertainment, part propaganda, you could say.
Politically, it sounds like things were still quite fragmented, even with unification attempts.
Pretty fluid, yeah. Rulers tried to centralize power, but constant coastal warfare and regional conflicts suggest that local leaders still held significant independence. Power shifted based on strength and alliances.
And the economy relied on this sort of redistributive system. Feasts and tribute.
That was a key part. Leaders gathered wealth from raids, trade, taxes, and then redistributed some of it through big feasts and gifts to reward followers and keep them loyal. It circulated wealth, in a way.
But how effective or fair was it?
That's debated. It certainly helped leaders maintain status, but the extent to which it benefited everyone or how evenly resources were spread is less clear.
Okay, moving into the Middle Ages. Does Norway keep leveraging its maritime strength?
Definitely. The Norwegian monarchy makes a real effort to solidify control over those northern sea routes, especially towards Bjarmeland. They knew how important they were economically.
And trade itself remained vital.
Absolutely. Interestingly, they had policies to encourage it, like allowing foreign traders relatively free access, just with a 5% export tax, the Siktjej.
Smart. Get the trade flowing, but take a cut.
Exactly. And a key item was high-quality russet wool from Iceland. Very valuable stuff, especially without standardized currency. It mostly came through Bergen.
Ah, Bergen. A major hub.
Became a really prominent trading center for the whole region.
Then the political map shifts significantly with the union between Norway and Denmark.
Right, a dynastic union. And this had huge consequences because the Danish monarchs essentially inherited Norway's medieval sea empire.
Meaning they controlled the Baltic routes.
Yes, putting control of those crucial Baltic Sea trade routes firmly in Danish hands changed the power balance in Northern Europe for centuries.
Now, let's talk about a huge cultural shift. Christianization. This wasn't an overnight thing, was it?
Not at all. A very gradual process, starting in the late Viking Age. For a long time, pagan practices and Christian beliefs actually existed side by side.
You see that blend in things like rune stones and crosses.
Well, it's just replacements. They were adapted, integrated into existing traditions of remembering the dead, marking territory. It shows a dialogue between the old and new, not just imposition.
But certain kings really pushed for Christianity. Olaf Tryggvason, Olaf II Haraldsson.
They were key figures, late 10th, early 11th centuries. They used a mix of persuasion and, frankly, force. They saw religious unity as a way to consolidate their own political power, too.
So religion and politics were intertwined.
Deeply. And while foreign missionaries played a role, the way Christian symbols were absorbed into existing monuments really highlights that local adaptation. It wasn't just imported wholesale.
So all these threads, the Viking legacy, medieval trade, Christianization, they eventually lead to the unification of Norway.
Right. It's the consolidation of those various Norse territories under one ruler, which mostly happened during the later Viking Age.
Harald Fairhair, is the name always associated with this, especially the Battle of Hafrsfjord around 872 AD.
Hafrsfjord is the symbolic moment, definitely. The legend says he won the kingdom for love, which is romantic, but...
Maybe not the whole story.
Well, the historical details are debated, but its symbolic importance is huge. But unification wasn't just about battles. Social and economic factors were pushing towards it too.
Like what? External pressures.
Yeah, shifts in trade routes, the whole Viking expansion context.
Yeah.
These probably created a need for more centralized rule for stability and collective action.
And the result wasn't just one king, but also cultural changes.
Yes, you start to see a more cohesive Norwegian identity emerging, a blend of Old Norse traditions and new European influences. And this unified kingdom then sets the stage for Christianity to really take root later.
Okay, let's jump forward a few centuries to the Kalmar Union, late 14th century onwards. Denmark, Norway, Sweden, under one crown. How did that happen?
It was mostly down to smart politics and dynastic links. Think of it as a major regional power play.
And Queen Margaret of Denmark was the key player.
Absolutely central. After her father, King Valdemar IV, died in 1375, there was a succession issue in Denmark. Her young son, Olaf, was chosen king, and she became regent, very skillfully gathering power.
And then Olaf also inherited Norway.
In 1380, yes, which cemented Margaret's influence across both kingdoms.
How did Sweden get involved?
Sweden was having its own political problems, challenging their king, Albrecht. Some powerful Swedish factions actually invited Margaret to step in.
And she did.
Successfully. She defeated Albrecht, basically bringing Sweden under her influence too. This all led to the formal creation of the Kalmar Union in 1397 in Kalmar, Sweden. Nobles from all three kingdoms agreed to this unified monarchy.
The goal was stability, but it sounds like it was inherently unstable.
Very much so. The idea was to create a strong bloc against external threats, like the Hanseatic League. But managing three distinct kingdoms with their own interests and growing national feelings, that was always going to be tough. Internal tensions were constant.
Okay, entering the early modern period now. Norway's still under Danish influence post-Kalmar Union, but things are changing.
Big time. Sweden eventually breaks away, but Norway remains linked with Denmark. And you see this clear trend of power centralizing under the Danish crown. Administration changes, royal authority gets stronger, often at Norway's expense.
And the biggest change, perhaps, is the Reformation. Luther's ideas arrive.
Huge impact. It starts in Denmark with King Christian III in the early 16th century, partly as a way for him to consolidate power, and Norway gets swept up in it.
So the Catholic Church loses its authority.
Gradually, but decisively. Lutheranism becomes the official state religion by 1537 by royal decree. This wasn't just about theology, it had major social and economic consequences.
Like what? Church lands.
Exactly. Monasteries were dissolved, church properties were seized and reallocated by the crown and nobility. That shifted wealth and power significantly.
Did it affect literacy?
Over time, yes. The Lutheran focus on reading the Bible in your own language encouraged literacy. So even under foreign rule and during this religious upheaval, you see Norway kind of cultivating its own distinct features, laying groundwork for later autonomy.
Let's look closer at that long period under Danish rule, 1380 to 1814. That's over 400 years.
A huge chunk of history. It starts with that dynastic link in 1380. And while Norway kept its own laws and some administration, the real decisions were increasingly made in Copenhagen.
So sort of self-governing on paper, but not really in practice.
Pretty much. And Norway got pulled into Denmark's wars and foreign policy decisions. Danish language and culture became dominant in education and administration. Lutheranism was imposed.
But a sense of Norwegian identity survived.
It did. Distinct culture, legal traditions, local governance, they persisted, which was crucial later. That underlying sense of being Norwegian never fully disappeared.
And the Napoleonic Wars put a massive strain on this union.
A breaking point, really. The British blockades hit Norway incredibly hard. Famine, poverty. It fueled nationalism and the desire for independence.
Leading to the Treaty of Kiel in 1814.
Right. End of Danish rule. Denmark had to give Norway to Sweden. But as we know, the Norwegians had other ideas, declaring independence, writing their constitution before that reluctant union with Sweden began.
So the Reformation in Norway was very much tied to Danish political goals.
Absolutely. King Christian III used it as a tool to consolidate power after the messy end of the Kalmar Union. Norway was essentially declared a Danish dependency in religious matters after the Oslo Agreement in 1536.
How was it implemented? Was there much resistance?
It was gradual. Monasteries closed, church lands confiscated, weakening Catholic power. Danish officials and pro-Lutheran clergy were sent to oversee things. There was some resistance, especially locally, but compared to elsewhere in Europe, maybe less widespread violence. Norway's smaller population and, frankly, the political and economic incentives probably played a part.
But it still transformed society beyond just religion.
Oh, yes. Translating religious texts into Norwegian helped boost literacy and cultural development. New forms of civic life and local governance started to emerge, even under Danish control. It helped shape a shared identity through language and religion.
The Napoleonic Wars, then. A critical time for Norway.
Hugely critical. Norway got dragged in because Denmark-Norway allied with France after the British attack on Copenhagen in 1807.
And the consequences were severe, especially economically.
Devastating. The British blockade caused immense hardship, shortages, famine. But that suffering also, paradoxically, really fired up Norwegian nationalism. The ideas of the French Revolution about self-determination resonated too.
And it all culminated in Kiel.
The Treaty of Kiel, 1814. Denmark loses, has to cede Norway to Sweden, but the Norwegians resisted that outcome.
Right, the Eidsvoll Assembly, the Constitution.
A remarkable moment. Declaring independence, drafting one of Europe's most liberal constitutions, even though the union with Sweden happened anyway, that act, that constitution, became the bedrock for modern Norway.
Let's linger on Kiel for a second. January 14th, 1814. A pivotal treaty.
Absolutely pivotal, and maybe sometimes overlooked. It was a direct consequence of the Napoleonic Wars. Denmark, on the losing side with France, faced punishment from the winners Britain and Sweden.
And the punishment was losing Norway.
Exactly.
Yep.
The centuries-old union was dissolved, sovereignty transferred to the King of Sweden. Sweden had been promised Norway as compensation for losing Finland to Russia earlier.
Decided over the heads of the Norwegians themselves.
Completely, which, understandably, caused uproar in Norway. But that very act, being treated like a diplomatic pawn, ironically strengthened their resolve for self-rule.
So Kiel inadvertently fueled Norwegian independence.
You could argue that. It led directly to the Eidsvoll Constitution just months later, a clear statement of intent. Even though they ended up in the union with Sweden, Kiel had severed the Danish link and put Norway firmly on the path to eventual full independence in 1905.
So that union with Sweden, 1814-1905, it wasn't total annexation.
No, it was a personal union. Same king, but Norway kept its 1814 constitution, its parliament, the Storting, and handled most of its own domestic affairs. Sweden controlled foreign policy mainly.
And Norway developed its own institutions during this time.
Yes, gradually strengthening its government, achieving full parliamentary rule by 1884.
Were there ever moments when broader Scandinavian unity seemed possible?
There were glimpses. The marriage of Swedish Prince Karl and Danish Princess Lovisa in 1868 sparked some hope. And more practically, the Scandinavian Monetary Union in 1875, Norway, Sweden, Denmark, using a shared currency based on gold, was a real step towards economic integration.
But the union still ended in 1905. Why?
Growing disagreements, mainly over foreign policy and Norway's demand for its own consular service. Norway felt its interests weren't being represented independently on the world stage.
And it ended peacefully.
Remarkably peacefully. A referendum in Norway showed overwhelming support for dissolution. They then chose Prince Karl of Denmark to be their own king, Håkon VII. Norway became fully independent, balancing sovereignty with regional cooperation.
Looking back at the 19th century as a whole, it really was the crucible for modern Norway, wasn't it?
Absolutely. Coming out from under Denmark, being handed to Sweden.
Yeah.
The drive for true sovereignty was immense. The 1814 Constitution was the foundational statement of that democracy independence, even within that loose union.
The nationalism wasn't just political, it was cultural too.
Hugely cultural. A real renaissance celebrating the Viking past, folklore, language, fostering national pride. But they were also pragmatic, working within the Union until 1905.
Economically, things were changing too. Industrialization.
Yes, the beginnings of it. Timber, shipping becoming major industries, and later, crucially, hydropower. Cities grew, society became more interconnected, moving away from being purely agrarian.
So by 1900, Norway had a strong identity, a modernizing economy, ready for independence.
Pretty much perfectly positioned for it, yes.
These nationalism and independence movements then were fueled by both internal cultural revival and external events like Kiel.
Exactly. The long Danish Union created a sense of distinctness, even if marginalized. Kiel was the catalyst. The Eidsvoll Constitution was the assertion of sovereignty. Even in the Swedish Union, with domestic autonomy but Swedish control of foreign affairs, that desire for full independence simmered.
And economics and culture kept that fire burning.
Definitely. Industrialization brought shared interests, unity. Cultural figures like Wergeland and Björnson really galvanized national feeling. The final straw was that consular service dispute, leading to the 1905 referendum and King Haakon VII. A peaceful separation, which is quite remarkable.
And these experiences shaped later nationalism, like after World War II.
Profoundly, the Nazi occupation, 1940-45, left a deep scar and influenced post-war policy. Norway leaned west, but was cautious about provoking the Soviets.
The bases declaration in 49.
Right. No foreign bases in peacetime, even as a NATO member. A clear signal of prioritizing sovereignty, even when pressured during the Cold War.
Let's talk about industrialization more, especially hydropower, late 19th, early 20th century.
Hydropower became absolutely central. By the early 1900s, it was generating almost all of Norway's electricity. It powered homes, but more importantly, it powered industry.
Did that create other industries, like building the power plants?
It created a whole ecosystem, a domestic market for turbines, generators, transmission equipment. Engineering firms, construction companies grew significantly to meet this demand.
So it wasn't just about cheap power, but also building expertise.
Exactly. Norway became a leader in hydropower technology. It attracted energy-intensive industries like aluminum smelting, giving them a global edge. Government policy actively encouraged local companies to service this sector.
So despite later environmental debates, it was foundational.
Undeniably.
Right.
And the government, through the state power system, played a huge role in managing these massive, complex projects. Interestingly, this experience in managing a major natural resource arguably helped shape how they later handled oil and gas.
Right, that strategic state involvement. Let's revisit the 1814 Constitution again. It really stands out for its time.
It does, born out of that Napoleonic upheaval and the desire to break free from Danish control. Drafted at Eidsvoll, it was incredibly liberal, popular sovereignty, separation of powers, individual rights.
Crafted by a diverse group wanting a distinct Norwegian state.
Yes, leaders representing different parts of society, all focused on national identity, rule of law, democratic governance, a real move away from absolute monarchy.
But then came the union with Sweden just months later. How did the Constitution survive?
Through skillful negotiation and compromise. Norway insisted on keeping its constitution as the basis for its internal self-government within the Union. It required real diplomatic finesse, mirroring similar struggles for national identity elsewhere in Europe at the time.
Okay, World War I and the interwar years. Norway stayed neutral in WWI.
Declared neutrality, yes. Crucial for their shipping and fishing, but neutrality didn't mean immunity. Unrestricted submarine warfare hit their merchant fleet incredibly hard.
Huge losses.
Massive. Almost half their fleet sunk. The post-war years brought economic struggles, global recession, but also a chance to strengthen national policies on sovereignty and resource management.
And internally, social and political changes.
Big changes. Industrialization, urbanization continued. Labor movements grew stronger. The Labor Party gained influence, pushing for social welfare. The economic turmoil of the 20s and 30s, the Great Depression, forced more reliance on hydropower and further development of social safety nets. And while focused inward, Norway started paying more attention to European geopolitics, trying to maintain neutrality in a volatile world.
That 20th century neutrality is a key theme, isn't it?
A defining feature. Even in the early Cold War, despite leaning west, they tried to balance things, avoid provoking the USSR.
And still NATO membership in 49, a big shift.
A fundamental shift, yes, driven by Cold War realities. But even then, they added that crucial limitation, the 1949 Bases Declaration. No foreign bases in peacetime unless under threat.
Why? To maintain sovereignty? Reassure the Soviets?
A bit of both, probably. Securing Western guarantees while maintaining some distance and avoiding provocation. They stuck to it, even under pressure from allies after the Korean War started. It showed a strong national consensus on prioritizing peace and caution.
Going back to the interwar period economically, it was tough, despite WWI neutrality.
Very tough. Post-war inflation soared, cost of living went up. Being reliant on shipping made them vulnerable to global downturns. Wartime losses hurt too.
Then the Depression hit.
Exactly. Markets dried up, unemployment rose, domestic industry suffered, currency volatility added to the problems. The government had to intervene trying to stabilize the currency, expanding social welfare programs bit by bit. Those hard times really pushed forward economic reforms and social policy development.
Then World War II shatters that neutrality completely.
Totally. Germany's surprise invasion, Operation Reserübung, April 9th, 1940. Occupation lasted until 45, a brutal, transformative period.
But Norway resisted.
fiercely, despite being unprepared. The Battle of Narvik early on, with Norwegians fighting alongside Polish and other allied forces, was a testament to that spirit.
While Quisling collaborated, the king and government went into exile.
Yes, a Nazi puppet regime under Quisling was installed, but the legitimate government, led by King Haakon VII, operated from London, becoming a powerful symbol of free Norway. Polish press, among others, documented the resistance and the harsh conditions, food shortages, lack of basics.
And the resistance movement was active throughout.
Tirelessly. Sabotage, intelligence gathering for the Allies, both within Norway and from abroad. The post-war period required a deep national reckoning with collaboration and resistance, influencing later commitments to peace processes like the Oslo Accords. A sense of moral responsibility emerged.
The German occupation itself sounds incredibly harsh.
Immense hardship. Food supplies deteriorated badly, contributing to economic depression across the Nordics. We know about Polish POWs held in terrible conditions from refugee reports out of Sweden, which spurred aid efforts. That brutality fueled the resistance.
And led to post-war soul-searching.
Absolutely. A necessary period of moral reflection on wartime actions. Later, a significant acknowledgement of obligations, especially towards the Jewish community, became part of this reckoning. Historians call it coming to terms with the past Vergangenheitsbewältigung, crucial for modern Norwegian identity. And they had agreements with the Allies for orderly governance after liberation.
The resistance movement itself grew strong, didn't it?
Remarkably so. By early 41, passive resistance was widespread, unifying different social classes. The harsh occupation actually galvanized people, turning a fairly pacifist nation into one skilled in guerrilla tactics and solidarity.
Doing what? Sabotage. Nonviolent protest.
Both. Everything from civil disobedience, illegal newspapers, to organized sabotage of German facilities and transport. It was about undermining the occupiers and maintaining Norwegian dignity. Reports at the time stressed this solidarity, which really countered the Quisling narrative. The resistance became central to Norway's post-war story of resilience.
So after the war, Norway faced rebuilding and finding its place in the New World Order.
A huge task. Rebuilding infrastructure, healing societal divisions, dealing with the moral legacy of the war, especially regarding the Jewish community. This reflection shaped future actions, like the Oslo Accords.
And joining NATO in '49 was a defining moment.
A pivotal choice, not automatic, given the neutrality tradition, but the Labour government pragmatically saw NATO as the best security option in the Cold War climate, despite some internal debate.
Economically, the focus was on rebuilding.
Reconstruction and investment. Government plans prioritized industry shipping, energy helped by significant foreign aid, welfare policies were also expanded, laying the groundwork for the modern system. Post-war recovery really set the stage for Norway's future success and its international role.
That reconstruction effort sounds like a really coordinated national project.
It was. Strategic economic policies for stability and growth, backed by foreign aid for importing necessary machinery and tech, a major push for industrialization, modernizing shipbuilding, manufacturing, agriculture, encouraging innovation, and energy, especially hydropower, was key.
And this drove social changes, too. Urbanization.
Significant urbanization, yes. People moved for jobs, increasing demand for housing, healthcare, education. Labor unions became more influential, pushing for better wages and conditions. It all laid the foundation for the welfare state and continued growth.
The establishment of that welfare state is a defining feature of post-war Norway.
A massive transformation, driven by social democratic ideals, equality, solidarity, social justice. They studied European models to create cradle-to-grave security.
What were the key pillars?
Universal health care, pensions, unemployment benefits, child welfare, all funded mainly by progressive taxes. The aim was to reduce risk and inequality, foster social cohesion.
And it reshaped the economy. Lots of public sector jobs.
Definitely. Heavy investment in public services led to low unemployment, high living standards. Labor laws evolved alongside, promoting workers' rights, gender equality. It became a globally recognized model, really, underpinning societal progress.
Which brings us to contemporary Norway. Prosperity linked to natural resources.
Very closely linked, especially oil, discovered in the North Sea in the late 60s. That transformed Norway into a very wealthy nation.
The famous oil fund.
The Government Pension Fund Global. A prime example of forward-thinking resource management, saving wealth for the future. But there's also a strong commitment now to green energy and sustainability.
And its relationship with the EU is unique. Not a member, but closely tied.
Through the EEA agreement, yes. Access to the single market, but they have to adopt many EU laws without a vote. It allows sovereignty, but creates tensions.
Domestically, progressive policies, strong welfare state.
Rooted in egalitarianism, yes. Multi-party politics, consensus-driven. But facing modern challenges too, immigration, climate change, indigenous Sami rights, always adapting, trying to balance economic strength with social justice.
Let's focus on that oil economy. Late 60s discovery was huge.
Absolutely game-changing. By the 70s, oil was central, making Norway a major energy exporter. And developing the infrastructure for oil, much like hydropower earlier, boosted domestic industries, engineering, construction, manufacturing.
The government played a key role. Statoil.
Yes. Establishing the state oil company Statoil, now Equinor, in 1972 ensured state control and collaboration. Policies focused on efficient resource use, and progressive taxes channeled revenues into public services and that sovereign wealth fund. Again, echoing the state power system's role in managing hydropower's strategic state direction of resource wealth.
The EU relationship remains complex then, close but separate.
Historically complex, yes. Referendums in 72 and 94 rejected full membership. The EEA agreement gives market access, vital for the economy, but means adopting EU rules, even in sensitive areas like resource management.
So there's ongoing tension, control versus access.
Definitely. Norway wants to control its key sectors like oil and fisheries while benefiting from the single market. Studies show elite opinion is nuanced skepticism in some sectors, but many leaders might favor membership now, reflecting that balance between independence and interdependence.
And contemporary social issues and politics, still defined by welfare and consensus.
Largely, yes. Commitment to the welfare state, inclusivity, progressive governance remains strong. It's successful in reducing poverty and inequality. Politics is generally cooperative, multi-party, consensus-seeking.
What are the big themes now? Environment, social justice.
Those are central. Environmentalism, egalitarianism are deeply ingrained. Social movements around gender equality, climate, migration are influential. Key challenges include adapting to global changes, managing immigration and integration inclusively. It's about balancing tradition and modernity.
Finally, let's touch on Norway's cultural contributions, a rich heritage.
Incredibly rich. Shaped by history, geography, values, everything from ancient folklore to modern literature, art, music.
Big names in literature. Ibsen, Hamsun.
Giants. Ibsen, the father of modern drama. Knut Hamsun, Nobel laureate, exploring big themes, identity, society, existentialism. In art, Edvard Munch's The Scream is iconic, capturing modern angst.
Music, folk traditions alongside modern genres.
Exactly. Traditional folk music with the Hardanger fiddle, ballads, alongside contemporary black metal, jazz, electronic music scenes that are known globally. And folklore trolls, myths, remains a potent cultural force, inspiring art even today. Norway really punches above its weight culturally.
Literature and the visual arts seem particularly strong.
Deeply connected to Norway's identity. From Norse sagas chronicling kings and earls, right through to modernism, Ibsen challenging social norms, Hamsun exploring consciousness and nature. Their impact is global.
And art reflecting both the landscape and societal shifts.
Yes, from stunning landscape painting to Munch's psychological intensity. And there's a vibrant contemporary scene now, supported by the state, engaging with global issues from a Norwegian perspective. It's how Norway shares its story with the world.
Music and folklore also seem vital to that national identity.
Absolutely fundamental. Traditional folk music, the Hardingfell fiddle, the vocal styles like fad and stev carry stories of nature, history, rural life. They're still cherished.
And the folklore trolls and myths.
Very much alive in the cultural imagination. These tales emerged from that close, sometimes challenging relationship with nature. They got intertwined with history, and collecting them in the 19th century was a big part of the national revival, boosting pride and identity.
Still relevant today.
Definitely. Folk traditions influence contemporary music, and the folklore inspires art, tourism. It's this constant interplay between heritage and modern life.
So wrapping up this deep dive, Norway's history is really a story of adaptation, resilience, and forging this strong national identity.
Absolutely. We've seen the journey from the Viking Age through unions, occupation, to becoming this prosperous, influential, modern nation.
Any key aha moments that stood out for you?
I think those links between geography and destiny are always striking, how the fjords shaped the Vikings. Also, the way traditions blended pagan and Christian rather than just being replaced, and that persistent drive for self-determination running through centuries.
Looking ahead now, Norway has resource wealth, a commitment to sustainability. What challenges and opportunities lie ahead? How will its history shape its future path?
That's the big question, isn't it? And maybe something for you, our listener, to think about. What parts of this history resonated most with you? Which stories would you want to explore further?
There's always more to uncover. We encourage you to keep digging.